The antiseptic scent of the hospital room pressed against Xia Zhichu's nostrils, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of fear that coated her tongue. Sunlight, fractured by the blinds, cast stripes across the pristine white sheets, a stark reminder of the fractured state of her own life. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes that couldn't quite mask a professional detachment, held the ultrasound image towards her. "Congratulations," she said, a practiced smile on her lips. "You're pregnant." Pregnant. The word echoed in the sterile silence, bouncing off the walls of Xia Zhichu's mind. A hollow, echoing chamber where hope struggled to take root amidst the thorny weeds of her reality. Her grandmother, frail and fading, lay in the next room, tethered to life by machines and dwindling hope. Her father, the man who should have been her protector, had become her tormentor, his greed a gaping maw threatening to swallow her whole. And now, this. A life growing within her, a tiny seed of promise sown in barren soil. Triplets, actually, the doctor continued, her voice laced with a touch of awe. You have a rare fertility physique. Rare. A word she had heard before, not as a blessing, but as a curse. A commodity to be bought and sold. A vulnerability to be exploited. Her stomach churned, a sickening mix of fear and nausea. Triplets. 3 lives depending on her, a woman barely capable of navigating her own precarious existence. Triplets, she whispered, the word a fragile breath against the sterile air. Her fingers, calloused from years of hard work, trembled as they reached out to touch the blurry image. 3 tiny flickering shapes, the size of sesame seeds, held the weight of her future. Her grandmother's mounting medical bills, her father's relentless demands, and now, 3 innocent lives. How could she possibly? The question choked her, a knot of despair tightening in her throat. Where is the child's father? The doctor inquired gently, her voice pulling Xia Zhichu back from the precipice of panic. The question, so simple, so expected, felt like a branding iron searing her shame. The father. A fleeting encounter, a desperate bargain struck in the shadows of her desperation. A man whose name she barely knew, whose face was already fading in the recesses of her memory. A man who wouldn't care. He's not involved, she stammered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. The doctor's eyes, though kind, held a flicker of knowing, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken truths that hung heavy in the air. Xia Zhichu averted her gaze, focusing on the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor in the next room, a fragile lifeline connecting her to her grandmother. Later, sitting by her grandmother's bedside, the sterile scent of the hospital clinging to her clothes like a shroud, Xia Zhichu watched the rise and fall of her chest, each shallow breath a precious victory against the encroaching darkness. The doctor's words echoed in her mind, sometimes, a coma patient needs stimulation, a familiar voice, a loving touch, stimulation. The word resonated with an unexpected irony. Her life, once a placid stream, had become a raging torrent, each day a relentless barrage of challenges, each decision a desperate gamble. And now, these 3 tiny lives, a symphony of heartbeats echoing the turbulent rhythm of her own existence. She reached out, her hand hovering over her grandmother's withered one. The skin was paper-thin, the bones fragile beneath. A wave of grief washed over her, a suffocating tide threatening to pull her under. She thought of her father, his callous indifference a constant wound. He had already begun to view her pregnancy as a business opportunity, a chance to extract more money from whoever fathered the children. The thought sent a shiver of revulsion down her spine. She would protect these children, no matter the cost. She would shield them from the ugliness of the world, from the predatory gaze of men like her father and Boss Zhao. Boss Zhao. The name itself was a venomous whisper, a reminder of the dark path she had almost taken. He had offered her money, a fortune that could have saved her grandmother. But the price was her freedom, her dignity, her very soul. She had escaped his clutches once, but the fear of his return lingered, a shadow lurking at the edges of her awareness. She closed her eyes, willing herself to find a sliver of strength, a flicker of hope amidst the encroaching despair. She had to find a way. For her grandmother, for her children, for herself. She had to fight. The thought, though fragile, took root in her heart, a tiny seed of defiance pushing through the hardened soil of her fear. She would not be broken. She would not be consumed. She would survive. The faintest squeeze of her grandmother's hand startled her. Her eyes flew open, her heart pounding against her ribs. The eyelids fluttered, then slowly, miraculously, opened. A flicker of recognition, a spark of life rekindled in the depths of those aged eyes. "Jichu," her grandmother whispered, her voice raspy, but undeniably present. A sob escaped Xia Jichu's lips, a mixture of relief and overwhelming joy. Hope, once a distant flicker, now burned brightly within her, a beacon in the darkness, illuminating the treacherous path ahead. She had her grandmother, she had her children, and she had her newfound resolve. It wouldn't be easy, but she would face whatever came, one breath at a time, one heartbeat at a time. She was a survivor. And she would not be defeated. The air in the small apartment hung thick with the scent of aged wood and simmering herbs. A single, flickering bulb cast long, dancing shadows across the worn floral wallpaper, illuminating dust motes swirling in the stillness. Xia Jichu sat on a low stool beside her grandmother's bed, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic rasp of the old woman's breathing. Her fingers traced the faded patterns of the quilt, each loop a silent repetition of the anxieties churning within her. 3 tiny lives. 3 heartbeats echoing the tremor of fear in her own chest. How could she, barely more than a child herself, shoulder this burden? The thought of Mo Beishao, a man as cold and distant as the winter moon, offered little comfort. He was a phantom, a fleeting presence in a nightmare that refused to recede. Her grandmother's eyelids fluttered open, a flicker of awareness in the depths of her cloudy eyes. Jichu's breath caught. Guilt pricked at her conscience. This frail woman, the only anchor in her turbulent life, was tethered to a hospital bed, her own struggles overshadowed by Jichu's desperate predicament. Grandmother, the word was barely a whisper, choked with unshed tears. The old woman's hand, papery thin and surprisingly strong, reached out, gripping Jichu's. "Child," she rasped, her voice a dry rustle, "I know." Jichu's heart plummeted. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the truth remained hidden, a secret she could somehow bear alone. But her grandmother, with the uncanny intuition of the aged, had seen through the carefully constructed facade. How did you?" Jichu stammered, the words catching in her throat. A faint smile touched the grandmother's lips. "A mother knows, child. And a grandmother sees even more." Her gaze softened, a gentle warmth radiating from her tired eyes. 3, isn't it?" Jichu's head dipped in silent acknowledgement. Shame mingled with relief. The burden, though still heavy, felt marginally lighter, shared now with the one person who had always offered unconditional love. "Don't fret, child," her grandmother continued, her voice gaining strength. This is a blessing. A gift from heaven." "A blessing?" Jichu struggled to reconcile the word with the crushing weight of reality. A gift? It felt more like a curse, a shackle binding her to an uncertain future. Her grandmother, as if sensing her granddaughter's turmoil, squeezed her hand tighter. "There's a way," she whispered, a conspiratorial glint in her eyes. "An old remedy passed down through generations." She beckoned Jichu closer, her voice dropping to a hushed murmur, explaining an ancient herbal concoction, a potent stimulant capable of rousing even the deepest slumber. Jichu listened intently, her initial skepticism gradually giving way to a flicker of hope. Later that night, after her grandmother had drifted back to sleep, Jichu sat by the window, staring out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. The herbal remedy simmered on a small burner, its earthy aroma filling the room. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "This is my grandson, it's your husband too. As long as there is that kind of stimulation, he will definitely wake up." Her thoughts drifted to Mo Beishao. She had seen a fleeting vulnerability in his eyes, a flicker of humanity beneath the icy exterior. Could this remedy, this ancient secret, be the key to unlocking not only her grandmother's recovery but also a connection with the enigmatic father of her children? The uncertainty was a gnawing emptiness in her stomach. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, painting the room in a warm glow. Jichu carried the carefully prepared herbal concoction to the hospital, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the hushed whispers of nurses amplified her anxiety. She approached her grandmother's bed, each step a conscious effort against the tide of doubt. Her grandmother remained in a deep coma, her breathing shallow and labored. Jichu's hand trembled as she lifted the spoon to her grandmother's lips. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I will definitely save you." Drop by painstaking drop, she administered the remedy, her gaze fixed on her grandmother's face, searching for any sign of response. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence in the room was suffocating. Then, a flicker. A twitch of her grandmother's eyelid. Jichu's breath caught. Her grandmother's eyes fluttered open, cloudy at first, then gradually focusing on Jichu's face. A weak smile spread across her lips. "Jichu," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tears streamed down Jichu's face. Relief washed over her in a tidal wave. The remedy had worked. Hope, once a distant flicker, now burned brightly within her. The weight on her chest eased, replaced by a surge of determination. She would face whatever lay ahead, for her grandmother, for her children, and perhaps, even for the enigmatic Mo Beishao. The path was still shrouded in uncertainty, but for the first time in a long time, she saw a glimmer of light. The faintest hint of a dawn breaking on the horizon. The herbal stimulation had awakened more than just her grandmother, it had ignited a spark of resilience within her, a fierce resolve to protect the precious lives entrusted to her care. The antiseptic scent of the hospital room pressed down on Xia Jichu, a suffocating blanket woven with the sterile hum of machinery. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, unforgiving glare on the still figure in the bed. Her grandmother, frail and paper-thin, lay connected to a web of tubes and wires, her breath shallow and uneven. Jichu reached out, her hand hovering over the wrinkled hand resting on the crisp white sheets. She hesitated. Touch seemed an intrusion, a violation of the fragile peace that had finally settled after the tumultuous events of the day. Her stomach twisted, a knot of guilt and fear tightening with each passing hour. 7 times. She tried 7 times, whispering to the unconscious form, pleading, cajoling, even resorting to the desperate measure the doctor had suggested, stimulating the patient's senses. Yet, nothing. No flicker of recognition in those closed eyes, no twitch of response in those pale, still lips. Each failed attempt chipped away at the fragile hope she clung to, the hope that this arrangement, this desperate gamble, could somehow save her grandmother. Night had deepened, the world outside reduced to a muted hum. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor filled the silence, a stark counterpoint to the turmoil raging within her. What if she'd made a mistake? What if this whole charade, this violation of her own body, had been for nothing? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, cold and sharp. She'd traded her innocence, her future, for a chance, a slim, desperate chance. And what if that chance had already slipped through her fingers? She squeezed her eyes shut, the image of Mo Beishiao's impassive face flashing before her mind. He'd been so cold, so detached, as if this entire transaction was nothing more than a business deal. A child. That's all he'd wanted. A child to secure his lineage, to fulfill some archaic obligation. He hadn't even looked at her, not really. Just a cursory glance, assessing her worth, her suitability for the task. The memory sent a wave of shame washing over her, hot and stinging. She'd felt like a broodmare, a vessel, nothing more. Taking a shaky breath, she forced herself to open her eyes, her gaze returning to her grandmother's face. The lines etched around her mouth seemed deeper tonight, the shadows under her eyes more pronounced. Guilt gnawed at her. This was all for her. This desperation, this degradation. She had to believe it would work. She had to. "Grandmother," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the machines. "Please, please wake up." Her hand finally reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool, dry skin of her grandmother's hand. She closed her fingers around it, holding on tight, as if drawing strength from the frail connection. I tried again," she murmured, the words catching in her throat. I don't know what else to do." A sudden flutter of movement from the bed jolted her. Her breath caught in her chest, hope flaring bright and hot. Her grandmother's eyelids twitched, then slowly, agonizingly, began to open. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. She leaned closer, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Grandmother," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Can you hear me?" The clouded eyes focused, a flicker of recognition sparking within their depths. Jichu's heart soared. It had worked. It had actually worked. But the words that followed shattered her fragile joy, sending shards of ice piercing through her heart. Who are you?" her grandmother rasped, her voice weak and confused. Where am I?" Jichu's smile faltered, her joy curdling into a cold dread. "Grandmother, it's me," she said, her voice trembling. "Jichu. You're in the hospital. You've been ill." Her grandmother's brow furrowed, confusion deepening in her eyes. "Jichu?" she repeated, the name sounding foreign on her tongue. No, you're not. You're the bride." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "Bride? What bride?" Jichu's mind reeled, struggling to grasp the meaning behind the disjointed words. "Grandmother, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm Jichu, your granddaughter. Don't you remember?" A flicker of fear crossed her grandmother's face, her eyes widening with a sudden, terrifying clarity. "Go away," she croaked, her voice laced with panic. "Go away. I don't want to see you again." The rejection, so raw, so visceral, struck Jichu like a physical blow. The air rushed from her lungs, leaving her gasping for breath. Her world tilted, the sterile white walls of the hospital room blurring around her. It hadn't worked. Not really. Her grandmother didn't recognize her. She saw a stranger, a bride, a phantom from some forgotten past. The weight of her sacrifice, the price she'd paid, pressed down on her, crushing her beneath its immense weight. All she could feel was the echoing emptiness, the hollowness that threatened to consume her whole. 7 times 7 attempts and all for nothing. She was left with nothing but the chilling echo of her grandmother's words, "Go away. I don't want to see you again." The antiseptic scent of the hospital, sharp and sterile, did little to calm the frantic fluttering in Xia Jichu's chest. Each beep of the heart monitor beside her grandmother's bed felt like a hammer against her ribs. Her fingers, raw from nervously picking at her cuticles, traced the lines on her palm, a desperate attempt to find some semblance of control in the chaotic storm that had become her life. Just hours ago, the doctor's words had hung in the air like a death knell, a cold pronouncement of impending loss. Now, her grandmother lay still, hooked up to machines, her fate a fragile thread swaying precariously in the wind. A groan, low and raspy, broke the suffocating silence. Jichu's heart leaped into her throat. Her grandmother's eyelids fluttered open, revealing clouded pupils struggling to focus. "Grandma?" Jichu whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. A flicker of recognition sparked in the older woman's eyes. "Jichu, my child," her voice, weak and thin, barely audible. Relief washed over Jichu, a wave so powerful it almost buckled her knees. "Grandma, your grandson is awake," she choked out, the words a jumbled mixture of relief and residual fear. The grandson, a figment of her grandmother's dementia, a constant companion in her confused reality. Hours later, a different kind of tension coiled in Jichu's stomach. The doctor, his face etched with professional seriousness, delivered the news. The surgery had been successful. Her grandmother would live. But the relief was fleeting, chased away by the looming specter of the hospital bills. 500,000 yuan. An insurmountable sum. Where would she, a struggling waitress with barely enough to cover their daily expenses, find such a fortune? The thought clawed at her, a cold dread seeping into her bones. The sterile white walls of the hospital seemed to mock her desperation. Each echoing footstep amplified the hollowness in her pockets. Her father, notified of the successful surgery, arrived not with comforting words, but with a calculating glint in his eyes. "Where do you get so much money?" he demanded, his voice laced with suspicion and a hint of avarice. Jichu flinched, her stomach churning with a sickening premonition. She had hoped, foolishly, for a moment of shared relief, a flicker of familial support. But her father's gaze held no warmth, only a predatory hunger. "You don't know yet," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a solution, a way out of this suffocating predicament. But the walls seemed to be closing in, the air growing thinner with each passing second. The following days were a blur of anxious phone calls, fruitless job searches, and mounting despair. She swallowed her pride and pleaded with relatives, only to be met with polite rejections and thinly veiled pity. Each closed door felt like another blow, chipping away at her already fragile hope. She considered selling their small apartment, the only home she and her grandmother had ever known, but even that wouldn't be enough. Then came the proposition. Her father, his face a mask of false concern, laid out his plan. A plan that made her blood run cold. "My daughter has a rare physique that is easy to conceive," he'd said, the words slithering out like venomous snakes. 500,000 for one child, ha ha ha, his laughter, harsh and grating, echoed in her ears, a chilling testament to his utter lack of humanity. The auction was held at a lavish estate, the opulence a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within her. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the murmur of hushed conversations. Men in tailored suits, their faces masked with indifference, surveyed the goods, young women, their futures bartered away for money and power. Jichu felt like a caged animal, her every movement scrutinized, her worth reduced to her reproductive capabilities. She stood on the raised platform, the spotlight blinding, the whispers like 1,000 insects crawling on her skin. Each bid felt like a hammer blow against her dignity, shattering her into smaller and smaller pieces. She wanted to scream, to run, to disappear into thin air. But her feet were rooted to the spot, her body frozen in a tableau of silent terror. Then, a voice, deep and commanding, cut through the hushed whispers. 1 million. The room fell silent. Heads turned towards the source of the voice, a man standing near the back, his presence radiating an aura of power and authority. Mo Beishao. His face, a mask of impassivity, gave nothing away. But his eyes, dark and intense, held a flicker of something unreadable. Jichu's gaze locked with his, a silent communication passing between them. She didn't know who he was, or what his motives were. But in that moment, surrounded by predators, his presence felt different. Not a savior, not a knight in shining armor. But something else, something complex. A flicker of hope, fragile and uncertain, ignited within her. A hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this man, this stranger, might be the key to her escape. But even in that sliver of hope, a chilling premonition whispered in the back of her mind. She had just escaped one cage, only to potentially enter another. The nature of this new cage, however, remained shrouded in mystery, a terrifying unknown waiting to unfold. The price of her grandmother's life, it seemed, was a gamble with her own. The opulent suite at the Imperial Hotel shimmered under the weight of crystal chandeliers, their light refracting off the polished marble floors. Xia Zhichu stood rigidly by the window, the city lights a blurred panorama beyond the glass. Each glittering skyscraper felt like a mocking reminder of the chasm between her life and the world of luxury surrounding her. The silk of the dress her father had forced her into felt like a shroud, clinging uncomfortably to her skin. A gilded cage, she thought bitterly, her stomach twisting with a familiar nausea. Her fingers traced the outline of a small jade pendant hidden beneath the fabric, a gift from her grandmother, a tangible piece of the life she was desperately trying to save. Just a little longer, she whispered to herself, just long enough to get the money for Alma's medicine. The lie she'd told her grandmother a night out with a friend tasted like ash in her mouth. Her father, Xia Jian, paced the room like a caged animal, his eyes darting towards the door every few seconds. The veneer of jovial affability he'd worn earlier had crumbled, revealing the raw desperation beneath. Zhichu could smell the stale alcohol on his breath, a scent that had become synonymous with her childhood anxieties. He hadn't even bothered to look at her, his gaze fixed on the promise of wealth that dangled just beyond their reach. He doesn't see me, she realized with a pang of familiar hurt, he sees a transaction. The thought sent a wave of cold dread washing over her, tightening her chest and making it hard to breathe. The door finally swung open, revealing a stout man with a slick-back comb-over and a predatory smile. Boss Zhao. Zhichu's father's face lit up, his anxiety momentarily replaced by a fawning eagerness. Boss Zhao, you've arrived. Come in, please have a seat. His voice dripped with a false cordiality that made Zhichu's skin crawl. Boss Zhao's eyes swept over her, lingering a moment too long, sending a shiver down her spine. The look wasn't appreciative, it was calculating, assessing her like a piece of livestock. He's already decided, a voice whispered in her mind, he's already imagining. She swallowed hard, fighting back the bile rising in her throat. How come you come here dressed so tacky? A deep, resonant voice cut through the air, laced with an icy disdain that froze the room. Zhichu's head snapped up, her heart pounding against her ribs. Standing in the doorway, a silhouette against the dimly lit corridor, was Mo Beishao. His presence filled the room, a palpable force that seemed to push the air from her lungs. He was impeccably dressed, his tailored suit a stark contrast to her father's rumpled attire. His face, normally an impassive mask, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Surprise? Annoyance? The uncertainty sent a ripple of unease through her. Xia Jian's face paled. Mr. Mo, he stammered, his voice trembling slightly, what a surprise. What brings you here? His eyes darted between Mo Beishao and Boss Zhao, his mind clearly scrambling for an explanation. Zhichu watched the scene unfold, her mind racing. Why is he here? What does he want? A flicker of hope, however irrational, sparked within her. Perhaps, just perhaps, this unexpected intervention could offer a way out. Boss Zhao, momentarily thrown off balance by the unexpected arrival, recovered quickly. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project an air of authority that felt flimsy in the face of Mo Beishao's imposing presence. Mr. Mo, this girl was given to me by my friend as a gift. He gestured towards Zhichu with a dismissive wave of his hand, his voice laced with a possessive tone that made her stomach churn. A private matter, you understand. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mo Beixiao's gaze shifted to Boss Zhao, his expression unreadable. A tense silence filled the room, thick with unspoken threats and simmering animosity. The air crackled with an almost palpable tension, as if the very molecules were bracing for impact. Jichu held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. A gift? Mo Beixiao's voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried a chilling weight that made the hairs on Jichu's arms stand on end. He took a step into the room, his eyes never leaving Boss Zhao's face. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Boss Zhao's bluster began to crumble under the intensity of Mo Beixiao's gaze. Misunderstanding, he repeated, his voice cracking slightly. There's no misunderstanding. This is between me and Mo Beixiao cut him off, his voice hardening. I suggest you reconsider your choice of words. He moved closer, his towering figure casting a shadow over Boss Zhao, who visibly shrank back. The air grew thick with the unspoken threat of violence. If I don't kill you today, your whole family will die, Boss Zhao blurted out, his voice laced with desperation. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of his fear. He reached into his jacket, his hand fumbling for something hidden within. Jichu gasped, a cry escaping her lips before she could stop it. Her mind screamed, run. But her feet felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into an eternity as she watched the unfolding drama, her heart pounding in her chest. The opulence of the Imperial Hotel shimmered under the crystal chandeliers, casting a deceptive glow over the tense tableau unfolding within its gilded walls. Xia Jichu, still trembling from the earlier confrontation, felt the plush carpet beneath her worn shoes like a chasm between her world and this one. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of fear. She watched, eyes wide and unblinking, as the men, their faces etched with a predatory intensity she couldn't comprehend, circled each other like wolves staking out territory. Boss Zhao, his usual jovial facade shattered, radiated a palpable aura of menace. The air crackled with unspoken threats, thick with the stench of expensive cologne and something else, something darker, that pricked at her senses like static electricity. What have I gotten myself into, she thought, her stomach churning with a nauseating blend of fear and regret. Grandmother, I only wanted to help grandmother. The man who called himself Zhao Dihai stood his ground, a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. He wore a simple, dark suit, his face weathered and lined, as if carved from granite. His eyes, however, held a glint of steel, unwavering and sharp. Xia Jichu noticed his hands, calloused and strong, clasped behind his back. They were the hands of someone who had worked, not schmoozed. Unlike the soft, manicured hands of Boss Zhao, which now clenched and unclenched spasmodically. Who are you? Boss Zhao finally spat, his voice laced with venom. He paced like a caged tiger, his gaze darting between Zhao Dihai and the room's other occupants, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Zhao Dihai's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. I am Zhao Dihai, he announced, his voice steady and resonant, each word a hammer blow against the fragile veneer of Boss Zhao's composure. Xia Jichu noticed a slight tremor in Boss Zhao's hand as he brought it up to nervously adjust his tie. The gesture, so small, betrayed the fear that his bluster tried to conceal. He knows this man, she realized with a jolt. He's truly afraid. A ripple of unease went through the room. Whispers erupted, quickly stifled as Boss Zhao's glare swept across the assembled guests. Xia Jichu, a silent observer in this strange, high-stakes game, clutched her purse tighter, its worn leather a small comfort in this alien environment. The opulent room felt like a pressure cooker, the tension escalating with each passing second. Zhao Dihai, Boss Zhao repeated the name slowly, as if tasting it, his face contorting in a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. Xia Zhichu watched, fascinated, as his carefully constructed mask began to crumble. This was not the smooth, confident businessman she had encountered earlier. This was a man stripped bare, his vulnerabilities exposed. Then, as if a dam had burst, Zhao Dihai continued, his voice rising with each word. "The diamonds of Xie family jewelry," he declared, his gaze burning into Boss Zhao, "were all donated by me." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Xia Zhichu could practically hear the collective gasp of the room's occupants. Even the faint clinking of glasses from a nearby server seemed to amplify the weight of the accusation. "Donated?" Boss Zhao's voice was barely a whisper, his face ashen. He shook his head, a nervous tic developing in his left eye. You're lying," he stammered, the words hollow and unconvincing. Zhao Dihai let out a short, harsh laugh, a sound devoid of any humor. "Lying?" he echoed, stepping closer to Boss Zhao, who instinctively recoiled. "He owed me a lot of money from stock trading," Zhao Dihai revealed, his voice laced with a cold fury. "A considerable sum, enough to buy this entire hotel several times over." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, each syllable a poisoned dart aimed at Boss Zhao's crumbling facade. Xia Zhichu felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't about her anymore, she realized. This was a much bigger, more complex game than she had initially imagined. She was merely a pawn, caught in the crossfire of a battle between two titans. The realization, though terrifying, also brought with it a strange sense of detachment. She was an observer now, watching the drama unfold, powerless to intervene. The room was a whirlwind of hushed whispers and startled glances. Boss Zhao, his face now a mask of desperation, stammered denials, his words lost in the rising tide of Zhao Dihai's accusations. The other guests, sensing the shift in power, began to subtly distance themselves from Boss Zhao, their faces a mixture of curiosity and morbid fascination. Suddenly, the grand doors of the room swung open, and two figures entered, their presence immediately commanding attention. One, a tall, imposing man with an aura of quiet authority, radiated an air of cold command. The other, a woman in a crisp, professional suit, carried herself with an air of quiet efficiency. Xia Zhichu felt a flicker of recognition. She had seen the man before, standing beside Mo Beishao. The newcomer's arrival threw another unexpected variable into the already volatile mix. The air crackled with anticipation, the power dynamic shifting once more. Xia Zhichu watched, her heart pounding, as the two figures approached Zhao Dihai, their expressions unreadable. What would happen next? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The opulent ballroom, moments ago a stage for Boss Zhao's arrogance, had transformed into a battleground, the lines of conflict blurred, the stakes higher than she could have ever imagined. The game had changed, and she, along with everyone else present, was caught in its intricate web. The opulent penthouse suite shimmered, a decadent display of polished marble and shimmering crystal. Sunlight, fractured by the cityscape below, cast long, distorted shadows across the plush carpet. Mo Beishao sat on the edge of the bed, the crisp white sheets a stark contrast to the darkness swirling in his eyes. He ran a hand through his hair, the events of the previous night a fractured, disjointed puzzle. He remembered the banquet, the insistent press of bodies, the cloying sweetness of the wine, then nothing. A void. An unsettling blankness that clawed at the edges of his control. He was a man accustomed to absolute command, over himself and his surroundings. This lapse, this vulnerability, was an unwelcome anomaly. He pressed the intercom, his voice clipped, demanding answers. His assistant's hesitant explanation filled the room. A drugged drink, a calculated setup. And then, the mention of her. Xia Zhichu. The name echoed in the silence, a fragile whisper against the backdrop of his unease. He'd met her briefly, a fleeting encounter at the hospital where her grandmother lay ill. He remembered the quiet desperation in her eyes, the way she'd clutched a worn purse as though it held her entire world. Now, her name was irrevocably tied to this incident. He found her several weeks later, not amidst the gilded cages of the wealthy, but in the worn, familiar comfort of her grandmother's hospital room. She sat beside the bed, her hand gently clasped around her grandmother's frail one. Her face, etched with weariness, held a quiet strength that resonated with him. He watched her, unseen, a strange protectiveness stirring within him. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes as the doctor explained the mounting medical bills, the way her jaw tightened, a silent testament to her resolve. He knew, with an unsettling certainty, that she wouldn't break. She would bend, she would adapt, but she wouldn't break. He revealed himself then, stepping out of the shadows. Her surprise was palpable, her body tensing as though bracing for a blow. He explained his presence, his words measured, careful not to shatter the fragile peace she'd managed to construct around herself. He offered assistance, not out of charity, but out of a need to rectify a wrong, to erase the lingering stain of that night at the Imperial Hotel. He told her about the drug, the setup, the fact that he had been unaware of her presence that night. The relief that washed over her face was visible, tangible. It was then that he realized the weight of the burden she'd been carrying, the silent accusations she must have leveled against him. Days bled into weeks. He visited her regularly, ostensibly to check on her grandmother's progress, but drawn by an invisible thread to the quiet strength of the young woman. He learned of her father's gambling debts, his callous attempts to sell her to the highest bidder, the crushing weight of responsibility she bore on her slender shoulders. He saw her vulnerability, the cracks in her carefully constructed facade, and felt a strange compulsion to protect her, to shield her from the harsh realities of the world. One evening, he found her sitting on a park bench, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The city lights painted the sky in a wash of orange and purple, a stark contrast to the shadows that clung to her face. He sat beside her, the silence stretching between them, heavy with unspoken words. "If you need money in the future," he began, his voice low, almost a murmur, "just bring this to the M.O. family to get it." He pressed a small, intricately carved jade pendant into her hand. It was a symbol of his family, a token of his trust. He didn't know then that she carried his child. 3 of them, in fact. Triplets. The news hit him like a physical blow, disorienting, overwhelming. His initial reaction was shock, disbelief. Then, something shifted within him. A protectiveness so fierce, so primal, that it startled him. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a liability, not a complication, but the mother of his children. His proposal was swift, decisive, devoid of the elaborate courtship rituals he'd witnessed among his peers. He didn't offer promises of romantic love, grand gestures of affection. He offered stability, protection, a safe haven for her and their children. She accepted, her eyes mirroring his own, a quiet understanding passing between them, a silent acknowledgement of the unusual circumstances that had bound them together. Their wedding was a small, private affair, far removed from the opulent grandeur of the Imperial Hotel. He stood before her, the words of the ceremony echoing in the quiet chapel. "I do," he said, the words resonating with a sincerity that surprised even him. He saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Later, in the privacy of their new home, he held her close, his voice a low rumble against her hair. "I love you so much," he whispered, the words unfamiliar, yet true. "I married you because I love you. Not for the children, not for obligation, but for the quiet strength that drew him to her, the resilience that had captivated him from their very first encounter." He knew, with a certainty that settled deep within his bones, that this unexpected union, born from circumstance and shadowed by secrets, was the beginning of something real. Something enduring. He would protect her, cherish her, and together, they would face whatever the future held. The darkness that had once clung to him, the lingering unease of that night at the Imperial Hotel, began to recede, replaced by the warmth of her presence, the promise of a future he hadn't dared to imagine. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the earthy fragrance of herbs that clung to Xia Jichu's clothes. She'd just returned from visiting her grandmother, the frail woman's hand surprisingly strong as it gripped hers. "My little sparrow," her grandmother had whispered, her voice raspy but filled with an unexpected lightness, "you seem peaceful." Peaceful. The word echoed strangely in Jichu's mind. Was it peace she felt? Or merely the numb exhaustion that followed a storm? The triplets, nestled in their cribs in the private hospital room, slept soundly, their tiny chests rising and falling in rhythmic unison. A fragile peace, she thought, watching them. So easily shattered. Her gaze drifted to the window, the city lights blurring into a hazy glow. Mo Beixiao had insisted on the best care, the most secure location. He'd built a fortress around them, protecting them from the shadows that still lurked. But at what cost? Her reflection stared back at her, a pale ghost in the glass. She barely recognized herself. The fear that had gnawed at her, the desperation that had driven her, had slowly eroded, leaving behind what? She wasn't sure. Just a quiet strength, a fierce protectiveness for these three tiny lives that depended on her. The soft click of the door opening startled her. Mo Beixiao stood there, his usual imposing presence softened by the gentle curve of his lips. "They're asleep," she whispered, a flicker of warmth igniting within her. "Good," he replied, his voice low and soothing. He crossed the room, his eyes never leaving her face. He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch sent a shiver down her spine, a complex mix of apprehension and something akin to longing. She'd seen the darkness in him, the ruthless efficiency with which he dealt with his enemies. But she'd also seen the tenderness in his eyes when he looked at the children, the subtle shift in his demeanor when he was with her. He was a man of contradictions, a dangerous enigma she was inexplicably drawn to. "How is your grandmother?" he asked, his thumb gently caressing her cheekbone. "Better," she replied, a genuine smile gracing her lips. "The medicinite's working." She looked down at her hands, the calloused skin a testament to her struggles. He'd paid for the medicine, of course. He'd taken care of everything. She felt a surge of resentment, quickly followed by a wave of gratitude. She hated being indebted to him, yet she couldn't deny the relief that flooded her knowing her grandmother was safe. Suddenly, a sharp crack shattered the stillness. The window exploded inward, showering them with shards of glass. Instinct took over. Mo Beixiao shoved her behind him, shielding her with his body. A dark figure lunged through the shattered window, a glint of steel flashing in the dim light. Time seemed to slow. Jichu saw the fear in Mo Beixiao's eyes, a fleeting expression quickly replaced by a cold, calculating focus. She heard the clang of metal, the grunt of pain. She smelled the coppery tang of blood. The assassin, a man with eyes like chips of ice, moved with a deadly precision. He was clearly trained, a professional. Sent by someone in Country M, she realized with a chilling certainty. Someone who wanted them dead. Mo Beixiao fought back with a ferocity that both terrified and awed her. He moved with a fluid grace, deflecting blows, countering with swift, brutal strikes. But the assassin was relentless. He pressed his attack, driving Mo Beixiao back towards the cribs. The babies stirred, their whimpers adding to the chaotic symphony of violence. Jichu's mind raced. She had to do something. Anything. She grabbed a heavy vase from a nearby table, her hand trembling. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and swung with all her might. The vase connected with the assassin's head, a sickening thud echoing through the room. The man stumbled, momentarily disoriented. Mo Beishao seized the opportunity, delivering a final, decisive blow. The assassin crumpled to the floor, his body twitching once before going still. Silence descended, heavy and oppressive. Jichu stood frozen, the vase still clutched in her hand. She looked at Mo Beishao, her heart pounding in her chest. He was injured, a deep gash bleeding freely on his arm. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I'm fine," he said, his voice hoarse. He looked at the children, who were now wailing loudly, their cries piercing the silence. He took a step towards them, then hesitated, his face contorted in pain. Jichu rushed to his side, supporting him with her arm. "Let me," she said, gently guiding him towards a chair. She knelt beside him, examining his wound. "It's deep," she murmured, her fingers carefully probing the edges of the gash. "It's nothing," he dismissed, his gaze fixed on her face. "Don't be foolish," she scolded, her voice laced with concern. "It needs to be treated." He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "The entire Mahist school must obey your command," he teased, his eyes twinkling. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Only when it comes to your health," she retorted. She carefully bandaged his wound, her touch surprisingly gentle. As she worked, he watched her, his gaze unwavering. Later, after the chaos had subsided, after the police had come and gone, after the children had been soothed back to sleep, they sat together in the quiet room, the only sound the gentle hum of the air conditioning. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you do it?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "Do what?" he asked, his voice soft. "Protect me," she clarified. "Risk your life for me." He reached out, his hand covering hers. "My wife is in trouble," he said simply, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Wife?" she repeated, the word foreign yet strangely familiar on her tongue. He squeezed her hand, his gaze intense. "I married you," he said, his voice low and husky. "Remember?" She did. A hurried ceremony, a rushed exchange of vows, amidst the chaos and fear. A marriage of convenience, she had thought. A means to an end. He saw the doubt in her eyes. "I married you," he repeated, his voice even softer, "because I love you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She stared at him, her mind reeling. Love? Was it possible? Could this man, this powerful, dangerous man, truly love her? He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "I love you, Xia Jichu," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I will spend the rest of my life protecting you and our children." A tear rolled down her cheek, a single tear of relief, of gratitude, of love. She closed her eyes, letting the reality of his words sink in. The fear, the desperation, the uncertainty that had plagued her for so long, finally began to fade, replaced by a fragile hope, a tentative belief in the possibility of a future. A future with him. With their family. A future she never dared to dream of, but one she now embraced with open arms. The sterile scent of the hospital faded, replaced by the warm, comforting scent of him. And for the first time in a long time, Xia Jichu felt truly, deeply peaceful.